Hello, I'm Joan Griffin, and you are here with us today for our Reading in the Wild program, where I'm going to be talking about a handful of books with you today. All of them about nature and getting out in nature. We're heading into the cold season, into winter, where we're not out there as much. And so maybe we're sitting in our armchairs and we need a good book to read about hiking so we can dream about it, what we'll do in March come the first day of spring. So I'm going to share with you today 4 books. It's more than usual, but I thought together that they actually create a story, and since I love stories, I put them together. So we're going to look at an old classic called Grandma Gatewood's Walk by Ben Montgomery. We're going to look at another old classic, A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. Then we're going to look at a couple of very recent books, In My Boots by Amanda Jaros, which just was published a few months ago, and The Trail by Ethan Galagly, which was published a 3 years ago. Why did I put them together? Well, because they span several decades, and it really shows how people's ideas about nature and about hiking have evolved. From the 1950s, when Grandma Gatewood walked the Appalachian Trail, she was the first woman to ever do that, and she did it in her 60s. From her day, where she walked in her keds and threw a drawstring bag over her shoulder, to Amanda Jaros, who hiked the same trail, going the same direction, followed Grandma Gatewood's footsteps, you might say, with a completely different attitude towards nature. And then finally, a look at Ethan Galagly's book, where the idea of pack it in, pack it out, leave no trace is in full form, where that was not the case many years ago. So let's start with Grandma Gatewood. Who was she? Well, she was an older woman. She was in her mid-60s. Her kids had all grown and gone. She lived in relative poverty and with an abusive husband who she finally, after 30 years, was sick and tired of. So just one day, she didn't tell a soul. She put on her tennies and grabbed a map and put a jacket and a water bottle and a little bit of food in a drawstring bag and threw it over her shoulder and started walking on the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail, as you may remember from a previous episode, is over 2,000 miles long, and it runs from Georgia to Maine. And it runs through woods and over hills and stops occasionally beside little towns. But this is back in 1955. The Appalachian Trail, in theory, was finished in 1938, but it wasn't very well maintained. No large organization had really taken it under its wing. The Appalachian Association hadn't really gotten very large or very diligent. Yes, there were huts to stay overnight in out of the weather, and yes, there was a trail, but oftentimes trees fell down and blocked the trail, and you had to figure out how to get around that big tree. Oftentimes the shelters were in disrepair, filled with rats, etc. And so she was really on her own. She walked solo and in a lot of ways was really dependent on the kindness of others. She would knock on farmhouse doors and ask to sleep in the barn, and they might feed her breakfast or dinner. She did that all along the way, and for a long while, no one knew where she was, nor what she was doing. She just sort of vanished. But then, as she met people along the way by knocking at their door and sleeping in their barn or bumping into them on the trail, there were only a few hundred people walking the trail in those early years, so it wasn't as crowded as it is today. But all of a sudden, word got out about this amazing older grandma who everyone called Grandma Gatewood. And then the local papers started picking up the story, and then the regional papers started picking up the story, and then reporters came out to the trail to meet her and interview her, and then crowds of people started showing up on the trail near their town to greet her and get her signature. It became a national thing. It was on the nightly news, where she was expected to be. And prior to Grandma Gatewood, most people in the country didn't even know there was an Appalachian Trail. They had no idea about the Appalachian Trail. But what ended up happening because of the publicity she generated and such a human interest story that she created for several months' time, I think it took her 6 months to walk the whole trail, all of a sudden there was a lot of publicity about the Appalachian Trail. And as a result of her walk, there was a greater focus, there was a lot of repair done on the Appalachian Trail, and a lot more people decided, I'm going to do that. And so it really focused on it. It is a really fun story. The author, Ben Montgomery, is actually the great-great-nephew of Grandma Gatewood. She was his mother's great aunt. And she was long past before he wrote the book, because he didn't write the book until the 1990s. He is or was a New York Times journalist, so he knew how to research stories, knew how to write a great, intriguing story, knew how to get the facts and interview people, and so that's what he did. There had been a family legend about her for a long time, and he was always curious about it, and he thought, this is really something I need to know more about. So he looked up all these distant relatives of his, and it turned out that she had like 8 kids or something like that, and they were almost all still alive in their 70s and 80s and 90s, and he sought them out and interviewed them about this. And he sought out all the old newspaper articles, and he brought all that information back together to create the book. And it is really, really a fun book to read, and it's inspiring. She used up 5 sets of tennies in the 2,000 miles. She had to come off the trail to replace her falling apart tennies. She didn't have hiking boots or good modern walking shoes. She just had the tennies that she bought at JCPenney's or someplace like that. She didn't have a backpack that sat comfortably on her shoulders, that had been fitted to her hips and had all the gear hanging off it. No, she had a drawstring bag that could have been made out of a pillowcase and an old string, right? Something like that. And she just threw it over her shoulder. She carried an umbrella and a jacket, and just sort of made do. But she had lived a rough, difficult life, challenging life. So the trail was really, in a sense, just one more challenge. But it was one more challenge that she could do all by herself. and make all the decisions by herself, without an abusive husband telling her what to do, when to do it, how high to jump, etc. And all her kids were grown and gone. It wasn't like she was abandoning anyone. But she found this peace and serenity by walking in the woods, and she found a community of people that kind of coalesced and then spread out and then coalesced and spread out. And she enjoyed it so much that she did it 2 more times. She walked 2,000 miles by herself 3 times. Amazing. An inspiration to us all. It's like you read this and you go, oh my God, if someone like that could do something like that, I can do anything. And it's fun. It's also a fun story. So I highly recommend that. And then we're going to follow that up with another older book written in the 90s about a hike on the AT in the early 90s. This is probably the most famous hiking book in the world, more even than Cheryl Strayed's Wild. I'm sure Cheryl Strayed read it before she walked the Pacific Crest Trail. This is Bill Bryson's book. Now, Bill Bryson is a professor. He's written like 17, 18, 20 books, something like that. They're all nonfiction, what we call narrative or creative nonfiction. That is just like the Grandma Gatewood book. It's a very true story, but it's told like a novelist would tell a story with, peaks of action and interesting characters, interactions, lots of activity and dialogue. Bill Bryson was born and raised in Iowa, but as an adult, he lived for 20 years or more in Britain. And then in the early 90s, he and his wife and kids came back to the United States, and they were living up in, I think it's New Hampshire, up in New England. And he now has, with his dual citizenship, has returned and is retired in Britain. But for the 15 or so years that he lived here in the United States, he took it upon himself to get to know the land of his birth all over again. And so the house he moved into with his family had this trail through the woods that kind of ran along the back of the property. And so when they moved in, he started walking one way on it and then walking the other way on it. And then he asked about it in town, and they said, oh, that's part of the Appalachian Trail. And he's like, oh, tell me more about that. So, of course, they told him it starts in Georgia, ends in Maine, 2,000 miles, very famous trail, the original long-distance trail. And he decides, what better way to reacquaint myself with the land of my birth than to walk 2,000 miles from the, almost the southernmost point of the eastern United States to almost the northernmost point of the eastern United States. So he decides that's what he's going to do. Now he approaches it in exactly the opposite way of Grandma Gatewood. Grandma Gatewood told no one and grabbed the materials that she had bare bones. He did exactly the opposite. He told everybody about it. He's a writer, he's a talker. So he told everyone who would listen, and he went to his local camping store. Maybe it was an REI, I don't know. That's the one I went to when I was getting ready to hike the John Muir Trail. But in the book, in the early 90s, he says he spent like $300, bought a new pack, the best pack, bought a new sleeping bag, the best sleeping bag, bought a new tent, the best tent, and the boots, and the water filter, and. So he spent months getting ready for this. And then he also buys what he describes as a stack of 50 books. That's what I did too. Bought every book I could on the subject to make sure I knew everything. So he read all the books, but the book that grabbed his attention was one about bear encounters and how to avoid them and what to do if you get attacked by a bear. And you can see on the front cover of the original books, there was always a bear. Anyway, he scares himself to death reading this book. And now he's of the opinion that, oh, maybe I shouldn't go alone. What if I fall down and break my leg? What if I get attacked by a bear and I'm all alone? Who will save me? So he decides he really, really, really wants a partner in this adventure. And he asks everyone he knows. And nobody says yes. So he's not going to quit. He decides he's still going to go on his own. And just before he's ready to head off to Georgia to start, a dear old friend from his high school days, whom he has barely interacted with for 30 years, calls him on the phone and says, hey, can I go with you? And he asks, are you in good shape? Oh, yeah, great shape. Well, they meet up, and the guy is not in great shape. He's heavily overweight, very out of shape, has just stopped drinking, and he's thinking this walk is going to help him with that project. So he's still glad to have someone to go with him, but now he's got all these things going on in the back of his mind that maybe he's going to be one that's doing the rescuing, not being rescued. So they head off to Georgia, and they begin the walk. CNN describes this as the funniest travel book ever written. And I have to say, it is definitely the funniest hiking book ever written. Bill Bryson is known for his humor, very self-effacing humor, satirical humor. He makes a joke about just about everything. And my favorite scene in this book comes relatively near the end, so they actually have gotten better at this hiking thing. They've stopped falling down so much, they've stopped getting blisters, they've stopped getting lost, etc. They're up in Maine, and they have to cross a pretty wide creek. It's shallow, but it's just, the whole bottom of it is cobbled with very slippery, algae-covered, round rocks, cobblestones. And they stand there on one side of it going, how are we going to get across? Right? They envision themselves standing on these wiggly rocks and slipping and falling and ending up in the river. So they stand there for a really long time watching the river go by, trying to come up with a plan. And as they're standing there, two very young men in their 20s with giant packs on their backs appear on the other side of the river, and they don't even slow down. They just practically run across the river and right past them with barely a hello. And the two older men go, oh, well, it looked easy. We'll just walk across. We won't have to run. We'll just walk across. Piece of cake. They take 3 steps, and they're both in the water. And it is the funniest hiking scene ever written. So, there's a big difference, though, in the two things. Grandma Gatewood walked back in the 50s, though the book wasn't written until the early 90s, late 80s. Bill Bryson walked in the early 90s and wrote the book in a couple of years. So the attitude about the trail had changed in large part because of Grandma Gatewood's walk. There were a lot more people on the trail, though not nearly as many as there are today. The trail is much better repaired and looked after because the Appalachian Hiking Association, or Appalachian Trail Association, excuse me, is much more active, and there's a lot more money being invested in the trail. And so instead of scores of people hiking in Grandma Gatewood's day, there are now hundreds of people hiking in Bill Bryson's day, though only about 25% of them finished the trail in the early 90s. So those two are a real contrast. It also shows the picture of how different people prepared to hike. Now granted, she went on a super low budget, but most people hiking the trail, even in her day, had, big leather boots and canvas backpacks on metal frames and carried literal pans and metal utensils and cans of food. By the 1990s, of course, things were much lighter. There were plastic frames and nylon cloth and much warmer, lighter sleeping bags and shoes and whatnot. So it's very different. And that's even illustrated even more in this book, In My Boots. The subtitle is A Memoir of 5 Million Steps Along the Appalachian Trail. And this is by Amanda Jaros. Now, she walked it as a 23-year-old back in the 1990s, a few years after Bryson's walk, though she didn't write it until the last 10 years, and in fact only published it in April of this year. She was one of the people that was influenced by the publicity around A Walk in the Woods. A Walk in the Woods was a bestseller. And if you look at a line graph of the number of people who attempted the Appalachian Trail or any long distance trail, and the number of people who completed, or the percentage of people that completed the Appalachian Trail, it's kind of like this. And then Bill Bryson's book comes out, and it goes like this. And then the movie that was made about Bill Bryson's book that starred Nick Nolte and Robert Redford came out a couple years later, and the graph goes like this. Well, that was when Amanda was walking, during that real renaissance or sudden interest in walking long distance trails. That is also close in time to when Cheryl Strayed's famous book Wild, about walking the Pacific Crest Trail, and that movie came out as well. So there was a lot of publicity. The book kicked off, and then later the movie. Okay, so Amanda Jaros is actually someone that I know, but I only know her because of the book. She and I share a publisher. And one of the reviews of this book says she walked in the footsteps of Bryson, Bill Bryson. She took 6 months to walk from Georgia to Maine, and she did it solo, just like Grandma Gatewood did. But because it was in the 90s, obviously she had much more efficient gear. She talks in here, it's a memoir, by the way. She talks in here about all of the people that she met. She describes the scenery. As you read this book, you feel like you are walking beside her, and you're experiencing the hills, the trees, the overlook, the spring flowers. She walked from March to October, 6 months on the trail, and we get to meet all of the people along the trail. When Grandma Gatewood was walking, that wasn't very many people. That might be a person every couple days, or only when you came to a town or a hut. For Amanda, there were whole communities on the trail. Groups kind of, as I said, form and then spread out, and then coalesce and then spread out. And the idea of having a trail name had become a thing. Anyone who hikes the John Muir Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, the Appalachian Trail, they all end up being bestowed a trail name along the way. And so people identify with one another, which is just marvelous. I'm going to read one of the reviews of this book, and I think you'll understand what I mean about how she describes the trail. Rhonda Habig writes, "Reading in my boots feels like taking a hike with a friend while she tells you about her life. Be warned that while reading the book, you'll likely start craving ice cream and M&Ms and have Dave Matthews songs stuck in your head." And that's one of the differences between In My Boots and A Walk in the Woods, even though they take place within a few years of one another. So the conditions on the trail are very similar. Bryson's book is a comedy. It's a laughing at oneself along the trail and laughing at everything else and everyone else. But it's a focus on humor and experiences, where In My Boots is more of a traditional memoir, where you not only look at the beautiful nature, you not only look at the people on the trail and the trials and tribulations you face, but you also look at how it's changing you. She was a 23-year-old just out of college and thought of herself as timid and didn't know what to do with her life, and maybe even kind of a scaredy cat. And she took this hike in many ways to kind of prove herself to herself, to prove to herself that she could do something big and important. And she did. And so all along the way, not only do we see the fun parts and the beautiful parts and the funny parts and the serious parts, but we get to delve with her into herself, and we learn things about ourselves along the way, as every good memoir does for us. So those 3 books are all about hiking the Appalachian Trail across time in 3 different voices. Grandma Gatewood is told as a biography by a third person. It's nonfiction. Bill Bryson and Amanda Jaros tell their own stories in their own voices. Again, true stories, memoirs. The 4th book I want to share with you is really different. It too is recently published, 2023, I believe, and it's about a different trail. It's about the John Muir Trail, which is here in California in our Sierras, but a long distance trail, 200 miles. But it's also a novel. Now, Ethan Galagli, the author, has hiked in the Sierras for years and years. He was a leading member of the Berkeley arm of the Sierra Club and a variety of other hiking and Sierra Nevada-focused places. And he has hiked the John Muir Trail himself at least once, I think twice, and he is in the process of section hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. So he has a lot of true stories to tell, but this is not a true story. This is a novel set in along the John Muir Trail, a place he's very familiar with and can describe very realistically. And his characters are very realistic. So this is a realistic contemporary novel. But he creates 2 fascinating characters that he puts on the trail. One is a young man, not unlike maybe Amanda was, out of college, kind of without direction, doesn't really know what he's doing with his life. And his father dies. and he's heartbroken. And that really sets him back even more. The other character is an older man who was the younger man's hiking partner of many decades. And he wants to, in honor of his best friend, hike the John Muir Trail, which he's never done, though he's hiked in the area a lot. And so he contacts the son of his best friend and says, "Will you, in honor of your father, hike the trail with me? I'm too old to go by myself." And of course, the young man really has no choice. And he says, "Sure, okay." But he's never done anything like that before. And he's actually afraid of heights and afraid of rivers and afraid of bears. And so they're quite the pair, because the older gentleman is very experienced, but is physically not in his prime, to say the least. So they are paired up to walk this 200-mile trail. And the young man at first hikes ahead and waits for the older man to catch up. And he kind of spends as much time as he can away from the older gentleman. But as time goes on, of course, with any good novel, we have a couple critical moments, and the two of them bond. And by the end of the story, as you can well imagine, not only has the young man learned great life truths from the older gentleman, but the older gentleman has learned some important life truths from the young man. So it's fun, it's funny, it's interesting, but it also has a lot of really good messages. Now, I would call this an adventure novel, but the author, Ethan Galagly, calls it literary fiction. And he does that because there's so much, maybe life philosophy exposed in the book. And so it makes a great companion to these other books as we go from the first exposure of what long-distance hiking means to a human being with Grandma Gatewood, to the funny, humorous events of long-distance hiking with Bill Bryson, to a more inward focus by In My Boots by Amanda Jaros, to, I think, a book that kind of sums all of those things up. And also in the process, because his hiking has been done in the 2000s, he brings us up to date with what current best practices are for people going out in the wilderness. How do you treat Mother Nature and the trail and your fellow hikers properly? What does it mean to do leave no trace hiking and camping? Pack it in, pack it out. What does that mean? What does it mean to honor other hikers on the trail and Mother Nature herself and still have a marvelous adventure in the 2000s? Now, since several of these books have been published, the number of people out on the trails has doubled, tripled, quadrupled. I know the statistics for the John Muir Trail, and I think they translate to the Appalachian Trail as well. On the Appalachian Trail, there used to be scores of people that hiked it, then hundreds. Now there are thousands of people who attempt it every year. It used to be 25% of the people got all the way to the end. Now there are something like 60% of the people who begin actually complete it. It's to the point that the Appalachian Trail Association asks people to not just start in Georgia and go north, or not just start in Maine and go south, but start in the middle and do what's called a flip-flop, where first you go south and then you come back to the middle and you finish it going north, so that not everybody is in the same place at the same time, and putting such pressure on the trail and the communities and the nature. And in the West, on the John Muir Trail and Pacific Crest Trail, it's gotten to the point where they have to issue permits to spread people out and limit the number of people who can be in one place at one time, because people's love of nature has sometimes translated into a destruction of nature. And more people care, and these organizations are getting more and more support. And I think you can see that evolution of how we relate to nature by looking at these 4 books in order, by starting with the earliest trip with Grandma Gatewood, then reading the other classic, A Walk in the Woods, and then following up with more recent books, In My Boots, and finally The Trail. I hope that you enjoyed this. We're coming up on the holiday season. Books make great gifts. I'm a teacher devoted to the idea of lifelong learning, and so almost everybody gets books from me at holidays and birthdays. But I would suggest any of these books for your reading, nature-loving friends. I'm Joan Griffin. This has been Reading in the Wild on Auburn Community Television. Thank you for joining me.